Hello and welcome to the webinar, How to Plan and Execute Your First PR Campaign. My name is Philip Smith and I'm the Head of News and Content at Cision UK, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's webinar. We often hear about the importance of business reputation, the power of PR and building your business brand, but today we want to focus on what you should expect to get from a PR campaign in the real world. Also, we're going to focus specifically on what smaller businesses, SMEs and startups can expect to gain from a PR campaign. We've got real-life examples of where to kick off your campaign, what you should focus on, how to keep track of it, and when you should start to see a return for your efforts. Specifically, we're going to tackle the following questions, among others. What SMEs can expect from PR? How to set up a PR campaign? What metrics to put in place? Making your PR work for you? And using your successes. We have some handy takeaways too. Look out for 10 top tips at the end of today's presentation. And we will of course be sharing the content, including slides from the webinar, afterwards, so look out for our follow-up email. Fortunately, I'm not going to be on my own in this webinar, and I'm delighted to say that Kate Hartley, MD of Carrot Communications, which specialises in working with SMEs and startups, is joining us today. Kate, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks very much, Philip, and thanks for inviting me on for the webinar today. Please do ask questions in the chat box as we go, and I'll try and answer them all at the end. It's been really interesting for me preparing for this webinar. There are some real differences in how you approach PR if you're an SME or a startup compared to what you do if you're a big established brand. I used to run the travel division at Shandwick many years ago, and I know how easy it is to phone a journalist and say, would you like to go on an all-expenses paid trip to Florida and return for a review in the Sunday paper, for example? But it's an awful lot harder to get the interest of a journalist if you're a small company or a startup, or a B2B company that's operating in a new or emerging environment, however exciting that might be. So I hope that what I can do today is to cover some of the positive things you can do in PR if you're an SME. I'll talk a bit about why it's worth doing PR, even though it might be harder to dig out that interesting nugget of information that might make a story.
Great. And Kate, I'll just interrupt you there just to say, also, Kate is going to answer your questions at the end of this presentation. So please do use the chat box and the question box on the right-hand side of your screen to send us your questions. So Kate, I'll let you carry on with the presentation in a second, but please do send us in your questions. And when you've finished in 15, 20 minutes, we'll get to those questions, and Kate and I will make sure that we get as many of them answered as possible.
Lovely.
Thanks, Kate.
I'll look forward to getting those questions. So I'm going to cover a number of areas today. What you can expect from PR, how you might set it up, what metrics you can put in place to measure whether you're doing a good job, and I know how important that is for small businesses, how to make PR work hard for you, and importantly, how to use the success that you have in PR terms to make an even bigger impact than just getting the press coverage, for example. But first, I'd like to share my own story. I'm not just a PR consultant, but also a startup business. In the 25 years or so I've been in PR, a very long time, I've worked for big agencies and small ones, and I've worked with global companies and also some startups, and with some startups that have gone on to become global companies, which is great. For the last 15 or so years, I've specialised specifically in working with fast growth or smaller companies. So typically those are at early stage. Some might be financed by the founder, for example, some by investors. They might be at various stages of seed funding. Some of them might be looking to on the beginning of a journey to an acquisition or IPO. But they've all got one thing in common: they're smaller and they're all growing quickly. A few years ago, I started a second company called Pulpio, which happens to be a joint venture with one of my longest-term PR clients, and it operates in the technology space. It's a crisis simulator, so it mimics what might happen in a crisis if a brand was to be attacked on social or digital media, for example, so that brands can practice how they might respond if that was to happen. And it's a great company. It's got a good team involved with it, and it's starting to grow quite quickly. We've got some really good clients. We're based in the UK, we're a young company, but there's huge growth potential. So what was interesting is I suddenly found myself in the position that most of my clients are in, which was a new thing for me, or at least where they were when they started out at the early stage. So I was spending my own money, and I had to really, really consider what I was going to spend it on. Think about absolutely every penny. It matters, as it always does when you're a young company. whether it's investor money you're spending or your own, you really have to know how much you're spending on pencils, and I can tell you that at any given point. And you have to work out whether what you're spending is contributing to the growth of the business and whether it really is giving you good value, and if it's not, you should stop doing it. So that's been an interesting process for me, because I've had to examine really the advice I give to clients. And at the beginning, we didn't have the money to advertise or to grow a big brand. We had very limited budget. And as I said, we had to evaluate absolutely everything for ROI, return on investment. I'm trying not to use jargon. But one of the first things we did decide to do was PR. And you could argue, I suppose, that I'm in PR, and if we hadn't done that, then I shouldn't be doing my job. But actually, my co-founder, who runs the social media agency, is also a really big believer in PR. She first came to Carrot as a client when she was starting out on her own, and she believed that PR was one of the most important things she could invest in. And at the very early stage, she spent a very small amount of money on 2 projects. The first one was getting her messaging right. So what was she saying to the market, and was it resonating? And the second was for us to research and write a white paper that she could use for marketing as well as sales. And it gave her a platform that she could talk, things that she could talk about. And we grew that program as her business grew, and I'm glad to say she's still a client 11 years later, and now also my business partner. So anyway, back to the point of what I was saying, which is at Polkio we do things a bit differently. We do PR a bit differently from perhaps very traditional PR. So we have very clear objectives, and PR absolutely has to link back to sales. There's no question about that for me. We know exactly where our customers go, what they read, and how they buy from us. We have to. And we know that the experience of going through a taster simulation, for example, is a great sales generator for us. So we know that events are particularly important because people then go on to buy our services. We know we have a strong group of people who influence the sales. So in our case, we sell into PR agencies that sell on to their clients. So we need to reach them either directly or indirectly through PR, through social media and events and sponsorships. So I hope that shows that I know what it's like to take my own medicine a bit. So hopefully my advice will be helpful to you today. So with all that in mind, what can you expect from PR? Well, the main thing is that it gives you a voice in your industry. I often hear a company CEO saying, I have a fantastic product but nobody knows about it. I expect that will resonate with some people on the call. Or we're in stealth mode, which is one of my personal favourites. Or we're the best kept secret in our industry. And good PR will help you work out what it is you want to be known for and give you a voice that creates that recognition that you need in order to succeed. PR will also give you credibility. So if you're included in a decent publication that's respected by your customers or your potential customers, that's going to give you some credibility that you perhaps couldn't get through advertising. It's an independent endorsement, or at least a review from a source that's credible. PR should also raise awareness, obviously, of your company among the people who will ultimately buy from you. So that might not just be in the media. We tend to think about PR as being media relations, but actually it's not. It might be on social networks or blogs, or by bringing people into your world, into your website, by producing some really great content, for example. It might be by going to the right events or speaking at networking evenings or on Twitter chats, which can be really useful, or associating yourself with other companies who have a strong market presence that you might be able to jump on the back of. Storytelling is a big part of PR these days, and PR can tell stories that bring your product or service to life and explain complex messages or concepts, again, that you can't necessarily do in advertising. So if you have a profile article or an in-depth comment piece, that can go into real depth about an issue in a way that an ad just can't do. So what you can do is you can set out your position on an issue or focus on a very specific part of what you do by, for example, telling a story about a customer's experience or by giving your view on something that's topical and of interest. And possibly one of the most important things for small businesses is it will give you a footprint online, and it will support your search campaigns. And that's so important and also measurable, which I'll talk about a bit later. At its most basic, once you start to be visible on different media, then you can be found online. And PR will generate links to your site from authoritative sources across the internet, and that search engines follow and rank. And that authoritative is really, really important. It's not just about the number of links anymore. They have to be authoritative links to be ranked by Google, and they have to be sites that Google follows. So media and blogs are obviously very good sources of authoritative links, and that will improve your visibility on Google and other search engines. Now, that really does matter, fairly obviously, but actually there's some data to back this up. The Harris Poll's Reputation Quotient report says that people do their homework on organisations before they commit to doing any sort of business with them. So before somebody buys, they're going to search you online, fairly obviously. But Harris looks specifically at what they call opinion elites, who are people who have a greater influence over sales than the general public do. 3/4 of opinion elites say that they'll investigate corporate behaviour before they buy. So not just the product, but actually the behaviour of a company. So that might be ethical behaviour, for example. And 53% of the general public will also do the same. But interestingly, 57% of elites say they decide not to do business with a company because of something they found out about how it operates, and that will start online. And 37% of the general public feel the same. So you really need a strong footprint of positive stories online if you're to have any chance of controlling your own story. So how do you set up a PR campaign? Well, most people tend to think PR is either sending out massive press releases to the media, which obviously, as Philip hopefully will say as well, that the journalists really, really don't love at all, or by launching products by having a press event, which tends to be the two things that I hear very, very commonly. And neither of those things is likely to work very well for SMEs. Unless you're Google or Donald Trump, you're probably not going to have enough news every day to sustain media interest in you on a regular basis. And certainly not to fill a room with journalists, particularly at the moment when pressures on journalists are so hard and they have so little time. So PR needs really to be a bit smarter. So what do you do? Well, first of all, think about the people who are going to buy from you. Who are they? Where are they? What media do they read? Are they on social media? What events do they go to? And you need to be in those places. What's the right message? Your message needs to be clear and concise and compelling. And it needs to run through absolutely everything you do, starting with your website and finishing with your content. Everything that you say should come back to that core message. And this is a really difficult bit for any company, I think, is that you should be able to describe the essence of what you do in 3 words. And we call this the between the commas descriptor. So if you think about how journalists or media talk about companies, they always have a 3-word descriptor between the commas. So they very rarely say a leading innovative end-to-end solutions provider that integrates with blah, blah. I mean, you'll never ever see that, but you see that in a lot of press releases. They'll just say software company. Even Marks and Spencer is high street chain. Microsoft, on a good day might be a software giant. And if you have a few minutes, go and Google jargon and press release, and you'll find a load of words that you should never ever include in any of your communications and that should be banned from your corporate language completely. And some of them are actually really nice words, sadly. They're just very overused. So innovation is one of those words that people just don't believe. So if you do have an innovative product, what you need to do is to demonstrate that rather than by describing it as innovative. And I promise you, journalists will thank you for that. Think about your tone of voice. What language do you want to use? In PR, we hand over our message to somebody else. In advertising, you talk directly to people. You can control the message. But in PR, we hand it over. So you hand it over to a journalist or an analyst or somebody who's going to quote you or share your message on social media. So you really need to use plain language and not jargon or marketing speak. And I hope I'm not using jargon. I hope that you'll stop me if I do at any point.
I will do, but there's none yet.
Great, great. If you're a company that doesn't generate regular news, and most companies don't, as I said earlier, you might think about how you create your own content that you can share directly with people via your blog or LinkedIn or Twitter and Facebook, depending on which is most relevant for you, or on media that accepts guest posts or articles, and a lot of them do these days. And if you have really great content, that's going to get people talking about you. So it's important to try and create stuff that people want to share. And take the time to reply to people who comment on your post or ask for feedback from the community, for example, if you're involved on a media blog site. Try to think visually. This is really, really important these days when there's so much competition for content. So images and videos are really eye-catching. And these days, they don't have to be expensive to produce. You can produce a decent video on an iPhone. There are masses of free tools to help you edit them. And you can create images with movement. There's great tools like Ripple, for example, that will work well on social media, just to create a little bit of movement on those images that will grab people's attention, grab their eyes. Put the work in. PR has a great reputation for being all about parties and press releases, and sometimes I wish it was, but the truth is it's actually a lot of hard work. And senior members of the business should really get involved, and they should make the time, I think, to write their own posts, write their own blogs, have their own opinions, get involved in social media. I really believe that. And post in your own voice. It doesn't take that long. You do have to carve out a few hours a week probably to do it, to research and write posts, but I think you should do it. And authenticity is a word that's much used these days. In fact, probably a slightly jargony word that's overused. But if you look at what it actually means, it's very, very important. I think if you're open and honest about who you are, particularly as a small business, and you'll have an authentic tone of voice, and you talk about things that interest you and that you believe in, people will see that. They'll see that you're really genuine and open. Don't expect PR to work in isolation. Like most things, it works much better when it's involved with other marketing disciplines. So people tend to think of PR as being free advertising, and it's not. It's sometimes works very well with advertising actually, and sometimes you might want to add a bit of paid media into the mix, particularly when you look at things like social media as part of your PR campaign. And you might want to pay to attend events. It's then what you do afterwards that matters. So are you following up those the people you met at those events, for example, with some of that great content that you've got on your website? Can you promote a white paper with a LinkedIn ad campaign, for example, as well as placing articles that based on the content with journalists or media that take guest articles? Everything, of course, should work really closely with your search program, so you'll need to link all those things together. The other thing I will say to small businesses is join networking groups and speak at absolutely everything you possibly can. Everything you're invited to, not obviously if nobody wants to do it. I heard a brilliant story a few years ago of a senior company executive of a big firm who bumped into a friend of his outside Highgate station. And the friend said, "What are you doing there?" And the executive said, "I've been invited to speak at the Highgate Women's Institute." And the friend was a bit surprised about that and said, "Why is somebody with your experience talking at the Highgate Women's Institute?" And the executive said, "I have an absolute rule that I will speak anywhere that I'm invited to do so, because it's really, really good practice at public speaking." And I thought that was a brilliant attitude. You never know where an opportunity might take you, and the more you can do it, the better you'll get at it, and the more you'll get invited back. Don't be frightened of having an opinion and expressing it. If you have a view on the future of your industry, for example, then share that. Journalists will be interested, people on social media will be interested, other people in your industry will be interested, and so will your customers. Create a platform of some sort. And when I say platform, I mean something that you can own. It might be a bit of research, or it might be a white paper, it might even be an opinion, it might be a campaign, it might be something you're just really, really passionate about. It's something that you own and that you can talk about, and that makes people think, "That's really interesting, I'd like to know more about that." That's really what you're trying to do, is grab people's interest and bring them back into your world and into your website. Ask for endorsements from your customers and also your investors. Investors quite often have a really interesting story to tell. And so don't just focus on your customers, think about your investors too if you have them. Journalists are always going to want proof that your amazing new product really is amazing. They're not going to just believe you, and they'll want to talk to your customers rather than hear it from you. They'll want some sort of proof. I think a lot of people had their fingers burnt in the dot-com boom and crash that everybody's products were amazing. Of course, a lot of them weren't. So now everybody wants proof. Be flexible. Things change incredibly quickly in most people's worlds, but particularly for small businesses, I think things change really quickly, and your PR should be flexible enough to adapt to that. If you've got a very rigid program, you're not going to be able to respond quickly to topical events, for example, or if a journalist wants to comment on an article that she's writing in 20 minutes' time, then you need to be able to have that flexibility to be able to do that quickly. And if you've got an agency, then that means you need to have an element of trust rather than setting out every single task in advance. There needs to be that flexibility in the relationship. And then the final thing is to be realistic about what you can achieve. If somebody tells you your story is going to get you regular national press coverage from the outset of your campaign, I can tell you now they are lying to you. So they're probably just trying to take your money. Put the time in to work with even the smaller media outlets. For a start, you never know where those journalists are going to end up, and also they'll appreciate the effort you're taking, and you'll build up your reputation gradually. So I always say just put the hours in and take the time to talk to new journalists or new media or smaller media. And that way, when a big news outlet looks for somebody to comment on your market, they'll Google you and they'll see that you've had all these conversations with different media, and they'll think you're interesting. They'll more likely to find you and talk to you. So once you've done all that, how do you measure it? It's notoriously difficult to measure the business outcomes of PR. But luckily, the industry is actually definitely moving towards that, which I'm really glad about, and away from measuring what we call outputs alone, so just measuring numbers of press releases or types of communication. In an ideal world, you put budget into understanding what impact your PR has had on changing behaviour and attitude, and that's the nirvana, if you like, of metrics in the PR industry, and it's the basis of the industry's measurement guidelines. What impact has a change of behaviour had on your sales? It is possible to measure PR in this way. You shouldn't just do it to justify the PR budget, but you should do it to understand what impact you're having on your audiences and use that understanding to inform your campaigns. But I'm also realistic and realise that actually the truth is most SMEs just don't have the kind of money to spend on that kind of research. If you do, that's absolutely brilliant, and I would thoroughly recommend that you go and do some research and evaluate your campaigns to find out behavioural change. It's the most, probably the most important thing you can do. But if you don't have that kind of budget, there still are some things that you can measure that will give you a good indication of what PR is doing for you and whether it's working. The most important thing to do at the beginning is to set out measurable objectives. If you don't have measurable objectives, you've got nothing to measure against. So they should be based on outcomes rather than outputs. So don't measure how many press releases you issue, for example, or count your press cuttings. It's utterly meaningless. But what you should be clear about is what you want to achieve from PR overall. So I'll just look at what those things might be. So if your objective is to raise awareness, how are you going to measure that? At its most simple, you can look at whether you're appearing in the places that your audiences are likely to see, or where they're going to be, or what they're going to read. And I would say you should value quality over quantity. If you get one really good article in a really authoritative title, that's going to have much more impact on your sales than a dozen press release pickups on syndicated sites that Google doesn't follow because it doesn't rank them or rate their authority. If you rank your media placements by their value to your business, then you can start to look at whether you're getting into the right kind of places, being seen in the right places by your audiences. And to do that, you need to know all the detail about who's reading that publication or blog. So make sure you understand not just circulation figures, but what are the kind of people, what kind of budgets do they have, what are they responsible for? Are you getting in front of the right people? You can look at the impact on search rankings, and this is a very, very important and very measurable part of what PR does now. So you can look at things like, this is most simple, you can look at things like increased number of searches on your brand name, for example, or the number of followed links that are back to your website. And by followed links, I mean the ones that Google follows, the ones that it rates as authoritative. How many links is PR generating back to your website from articles? If you set up your Google Analytics properly, you can look at where traffic's coming from to make sure it's relevant traffic. So you're getting people coming in from the right geographies, looking at the right search terms, and where there are spikes and dips in traffic, or spikes and dips in specific search terms, and does that relate to something you're doing in your PR campaign? You should measure engagement online and offline as well. I think a lot is said about online measurement, and that's really good and it's very measurable, but actually you should measure offline as well, which I'll talk about in a second. So online, you might look at who's sharing your content on social media, or offline, you might look at who's coming up to you after you've spoken at an event, for example. And the important thing is the quality of those shares and those approaches, not just the numbers. So if one person is sharing something on Twitter with one other person who turns out to be an amazing sales lead, that's worth far more to you than 100 shares of people who have absolutely no interest in your business. So numbers on their own are really not worth measuring, to be honest. Don't just measure PR by direct website referrals. That's quite tempting in Google Analytics to just say, well, I've got an article in this publication and it sent this many links back to my site. But don't forget how people behave. Most people aren't going to just read an article and go straight to the site and buy. Most people are going to research something a few times before they do that. So they might read the article, then they might search on a broad category. So, for example, they might, if they're researching a holiday, they might just research holidays to Barbados or something. Then they'll read some reviews, then they'll decide they want your product over your competitors, and at that point, they'll Google your company name. Now, when you look at your analytics, unless it's set up in a reasonably sophisticated way, that will then give credit for that lead to Google, and that's not necessarily true, because the first part of that journey was actually from an article, so just remember that. Things not to measure, definitely don't measure what we call advertising equivalent values. In other words, if you had bought an advert, the equivalent size of the coverage you got, how much would it have cost you? And we call those advertising value equivalents, or AVEs. And they're horrible, I hate them. They produce completely meaningless numbers, and they don't account for authority, they don't account for independent endorsement by a journalist, and actually, most importantly, they don't account for the fact that you can't advertise on some sites. So, for example, on the BBC, you can't advertise, but probably that's going to have a bigger impact on your brand or your sales than a small local press, possibly. You can't put an AVE equivalent to a retweet of your content by somebody who has real influence on your market, for example, who might actually influence sales. The smallest blog might have the lowest AVE, but it might be the single biggest lead generator for your business. And although the AVE of getting onto the Sun, for example, might be absolutely massive, it could have absolutely no impact on your business at all. And if you get your PR teams to chase advertising value equivalents, it means they're not focused on what your business actually needs. They just focus on making their numbers, and that's no good to you at all. We had one client who was really clear in his measurement objectives. He wanted to sell his business within 3 years. He'd bought and sold the business before, but he'd done it for paper, and that hadn't done him terribly well, because it was just when the bottom fell out of the market, sadly. So he wanted to sell this one for cash. He was very clear about that. And as well as doing PR to raise awareness among potential customers, we also worked with him to identify who his potential acquirers might be. So who were going to be the people who might buy his business, and could we make sure he was in every single market report that they were likely to read? So were we in the right analyst reports, for example, the right media? His company messaging, including things like what's going to attract acquirers. So we'll talk about things like scale, growth, the numbers that he was getting. And it would also look at things that position the company above its direct competitors. You can be a bit smart about the way you put your messages together. We entered awards. We registered him for listings that focused on financial growth and scalability, all the things that acquirers really value. And ultimately, the measurement, of course, was that the company was acquired, so the campaign was successful. And while I'd love to take full credit for that, I can't do that. Of course, we can't influence how the business was set up or the fact there were other factors at play other than just good PR. But we had a really nice endorsement from a major analyst who said that a large part of the sales valuation was down to brand awareness, and that was actually a really nice endorsement for the PR that we've done. Sometimes you get lucky, and a big lead might come in as a direct piece of as a direct result of a piece of coverage, and that's great when that happens, but it is quite rare. We had a client once who we placed into a piece in the FT, and they got one lead from that story. Now, one lead doesn't sound very much at all, but that one lead was a global drinks company, so that was a great return on investment. In fact, I think it paid for about 4 years of PR fees, so that was pretty good. In a small team, there's likely to be some anecdotal evidence of improved awareness too, and don't discount that. It's easier in a small business to track where a customer heard about you, so do ask them who recommended them and what they're asking for when they call. So you can just literally ask them where they heard about you, and sometimes you can get a bit of a clue about where they heard about you by what they're asking for, some of the words that they're using. They might have been influenced by something they've read recently. And you can make some assumptions. If you take a snapshot of leads at the beginning of the campaign and things like web traffic and coverage, right at the beginning when you start a PR campaign, then you start your campaign, and those things like leads and web traffic start to increase, you can make a fair assumption that those two things are linked. So to summarise that, so what you should track: visibility among target audience, sales leads, followed links to your website, social media shares, engagement at events on social media and in real life, and search performance. What not to track: number of impressions, AVEs, you may have gathered I don't like them very much, number of articles, and number of followers on social media. So making your PR work for you, how do you really get the best out of your PR? And I think, like everything in life, what you get out of your PR largely depends on what you put into it. I believe that PR is everybody's responsibility, just in the same way that great sales are everybody's responsibility. It shouldn't sit in the silo, it shouldn't sit on its own. And when I work with companies, the best clients are the ones who make themselves available for that media interview, even if they're in the airport about to go on holiday, and that has happened more than once, I have to say. They'll turn around and comment at really short notice, so they're more likely to get into a feature. And they get a reputation among journalists for being good, reliable interviewees and quick to respond. And I tell you what, that makes a real difference to a journalist. If they know that you're going to pick up the phone and give them comments, then you're going to go up to the top of the list of people, assuming you have something interesting to say, top of the list of people who they'll approach for stories. So I think I would say, advise people to treat a media or analyst opportunity with as much thought and preparation and commitment as you would a sales opportunity. Don't drop it. You wouldn't drop out a sales opportunity if something better came along. Do the same treat the media and analyst exactly the same way. Research. Do your research. Research a journalist's interest or an analyst's interest before you meet them for the first time, and read everything they've written recently so you know a little bit about them. Connect with them on Twitter. Give them your mobile number after you've met so they can ask follow-up questions. Journalists don't love it when PR people get in the way of direct relationships with clients. So I would think that actually if a client will give a journalist their mobile phone number so they can follow up directly, again, that's a good sign of a trusting relationship and a good spokesperson. Have an ongoing positive conversation with your PR team about what's actually possible. Again, I find the best client-agency relationships are those where we have a really constructive and honest conversation about what's worked and what hasn't, and not everything will work. So if everybody's motivated properly to want to make it work, it'll be really easy to talk about the things that don't. And then you can change the approach. If you know what hasn't worked, you can then change your PR a little bit so that you do more of the stuff that does work. And that's reflected in the contract too. So if you have a contract that's based on punishing failure rather than rewarding success, you're going to end up with a pretty demotivated team right at the beginning of the business. So a team that doesn't want to try something new just in case it doesn't work, and actually that could mean you end up with quite a dull campaign. You want to try a few things, take a few risks. Identify the people in your business who can shine. So you might have somebody in your midst who's a really gifted writer or a really good blogger or brilliant on social media or just with a really interesting different skill, with a language skill, for example, you didn't know about. So use everybody you can to help you with PR and give them an incentive to do it. If you're the CEO or the founder, tell your own story on your blog and record your business journey. And I always think that that's a really interesting thing to do. If in a couple of years' time, when you've grown and you're a big company, you can look back and see what the steps were that you went through at the beginning of your journey. That's a really interesting story to tell and nice to look back on. Make sure that everybody knows what their role is in the PR process and give them clear guidelines as to what they should and shouldn't do in the company's name. A big part of what I do is crisis management, so I have a horrible tendency to kind of look at the worst case scenario in every situation, so I can't help that really, but that may be a subject for another webinar. But do make sure that they know really what their role is within PR and what they can and can't do. Using your successes. I often see companies who do really amazing things in PR terms, but they don't share their successes with their customers, and I always wonder why not. Your customers are going to want to work with a successful company. Everybody likes to be involved with a company that's really cool and successful. So if you've been featured in an amazing publication or you've got a really nice piece of content, make sure you tell people about it and encourage them to get involved too and to share that content. We did this with the simulation company that I mentioned that I'm involved in. We were invited to run a workshop at South by Southwest, which is the big interactive festival in Austin. And it's a huge honour to be asked to do a workshop there. It's amazing, and we were a very young company at the time. We had a journalist there from a publication called The Verge in the US, which can be a bit snippy sometimes, but actually they wrote up an amazing piece on the workshop. And we used that in all our sales emails after the event, and it worked really well because we had instant credibility. And we didn't have to say to people, this is what we do. We could say, look at what a journalist said about what we do, and that worked really well. So if you've written a white paper as part of your PR campaign, for example, send it to your customers, use it in your lead generation campaigns, make sure you can use it across all your marketing and sales, make sure your team know about it. The number of companies that I've worked for who write brilliant content and nobody in their business has read it. Make sure that everybody has at least read the executive summary so they can talk to customers and people about it. That would be really helpful. To finish up, I've got 10 key takeaways that I hope are useful. So first one, set clear and measurable objectives. Decide on what it is that you want to achieve from PR and be very clear about things that you can and can't measure. Second thing is prepare. Who do you want to reach and what's the key message that you want them to take away? What's the thing you want to be really, really known for above everything else? Think beyond news and press releases. Create platforms and content that's really worth sharing, that people think that's really interesting. I want to know more about that company. I want to know more about what they do. Take every opportunity you're offered early on. Think about that man outside Highgate Station. You never know where it might lead. Just say yes to absolutely everything. Well, almost absolutely everything. As long as it's relevant to your business, say yes to everything. Chase quality, not quantity, and that's so important in PR. Don't worry about the numbers of articles. Just care about the quality of what it is you're getting. Take some chances. Be honest about what works and what doesn't. If you can have an honest conversation about that, then you can make sure that you do more of the stuff that does work. Measurement. Measure outcomes, not outputs, where you possibly can. And be the best, most available spokesperson. If you really are the best spokesperson and you'll pick up your mobile phone at a minute's notice, the journalist will love you for it. Give everybody responsibility for PR and be very clear and create those guidelines on what they should and shouldn't do. And finally, share your successes. It's going to be motivating for you. It'll motivate your teams, it'll motivate your customers, and it'll motivate your prospects as well. So I hope some of that's been useful. I look forward to answering any questions. We've got some in.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And I must say, actually, as you were going through that webinar, I was taking some notes and I was aware we had 10 key takeaways, but I also spotted 15 do's on your slide as well. Okay. So I think we've got 25 top tips at least there for people to think about and to take away. And yes, let me remind you all that we will share slides and content from the webinar afterwards, so look out for that email and we'll make sure there's those takeaways. Now, I can see plenty of questions are coming in, but do send in your questions for Kate and help me put Kate on the spot. And we shall quiz her on her thoughts, because we've got a good 10, 15 minutes for a Q&A. Before we come to your questions, though, I'm going to ask Kate one thing which I thought really was sort of universal question, and that is, Kate, I know you've worked in many different sort of verticals and sectors in your PR career, including travel, technology, and so on. Do you think, hand on heart, that PR is for everyone? Can every company benefit from PR, or is it actually really companies in certain sectors?
It's a really good question. I'm probably going to give you a bit of a PR answer on that, which is that I think every company could benefit from PR depending on where they are in their life cycle or where they are in their formation. I think that sometimes it can be too early for companies to do PR or to spend a lot of money on PR. If, for example, you don't have customers or you haven't got your messaging right or you don't really know what it is that you're offering yet, as you're still very early on that journey, then I would say don't. And we do turn down companies sometimes actually who come to us saying we want PR, and you think actually there's something you need to go and sort out first. Make sure your website's working really well, make sure that your sales are started, all that kind of thing. But I think in terms of sector, I can't think of a sector that wouldn't benefit from having a better reputation among its customers or its target audiences. And that's at the bottom line, that's what PR does. So yes, I think every sector would benefit from PR.
Great. Now, I can see lots of questions here. I can see some really interesting ones on budget, so I'm sure you look forward to that one, Kate. On analysts as well, which is an interesting angle, and social media. So we're going to come to those in a minute. I'm going to start off, though. There's a great question here about amounts of coverage, and I think it sort of gets to the client-agency relationship, but I think it also looks at possibly what you've been saying about outputs and outcomes. Anyway, the question is this. I find it hard selling PR ideas to clients because they often require a large amount of investment, and it's impossible to give them a guaranteed amount of coverage. How do you get around this?
Oh God, it's a really good question. I have to say I face that too. I know exactly, I feel your pain. You can't guarantee coverage, is the honest truth of it. You really can't. You can give an idea of what coverage you might expect given past performance. If you're trying something really new, you cannot, unless you're advertising, guarantee an amount of coverage. If some huge political event happens on the day that your campaign breaks, for example, then your campaign may just fall off the news agenda altogether. You really can't. You can't make any guarantees in PR, and this is one of the big problems about measurement. I think it's difficult. The issue really is you have to have a really good relationship with your client, and they have to trust you, and they have to be willing to take a bit of a risk. And if they're not willing to take a risk, then I would say don't do it. Don't take the risk. They say if they're not willing to do it, then it has to be something that you're both prepared to do.
Gosh, so sometimes you may need to say no.
Yeah, absolutely. No's a big word in PR. It's hard to do.
Of course. I can see we've also got some questions about getting this commitment and investment into PR. So the first one is about startups. So we'll tackle this question first, Kate. When a startup is rising, the investors do not want to spend money to PR. I think that means on PR. How can we convince them that PR will produce value to the company?
Well, that kind of goes back to almost to the first question, isn't it? Which is sadly there are no guarantees. But if your investors don't believe that reputation is important to the growth of the company, possibly they're not the right investors. I mean, I think most investors would believe that. If you can get the budget right, I would say start small. So take a small risk. Don't commit to an annual fee, for example, or to a huge amount of spend per month. Start small. We quite often start with a month or a couple of months. Or a very specific project, and then people see that works, and then they want to invest more. So I think start small, grow it, and you'll prove the value. Great,
and I think related to this is how much is small actually in terms of budget. So let me read this question to you, Kate. How much budget should a small business, £1 million to £2 million in revenue, with growth ambitions, put aside for PR? I appreciate how long is a piece of string, but what is the minimum consideration to get a return? And or for it to be not wasted, be a wasted investment. Perhaps provide an example if difficult to make a more general statement. So Kate, you're not allowed to say how long is a piece of string, but what would you say is there a ratio, for instance, that you might look at for the investments in PR when you're starting off, or is it more intuitive than that?
I don't think there's a ratio, but I would say £1 to £2 million business is probably pretty established with good customers. Probably a decent story to tell, a proper infrastructure. I would say probably you should be spending between £2,000 and £3,000 a month on PR to get a decent return. Now, I mean, that is a bit, how long is a piece of string, I know, but I would say roughly that sort of amount would get you a reasonable amount of attention in the media among analysts. But again, go back to my point about you really need to work out what it is that you want to achieve. So that may not just be media relations, for example, it might be analysts and events and all those other things that PR can include. But that's roughly the amount I would say for a company that size. Great.
I can see we've got a few more budget-related questions, so we're going to come back to those in a minute because I want to cover some other areas first. I think the first one is actually this is a really interesting one because you've worked with so many startups and small businesses right at the start of their sort of journey, Kate. This question is very straightforward. Is the company name, does that have a big part on the success of the company?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. And one, I mean, I think I used to say no, not really, because I used to say that International Business Machines is a really rubbish name for a company, but it hasn't hurt IBM. Microsoft is a pretty awful name, I'd say, but it hasn't really hurt them either. But possibly you could say they were operating in new markets and therefore could get away with an awful name. I think it does matter. We've just been through an exercise with a client, I can't tell you the specifics, Abby, but it's a company that's just rebranded, and they came from a name that was very functional and really described what they did. And then what they did started to change, and so their name was actually really holding them back. And we found that in doing PR for them under the new brand name, they've got more traction in media, more interest, because their name is now more reflective of what they do. Obviously brand is more than a name, but let's assume that we're starting with the name and the logo. When I started a company, we struggled so badly to come up with a name. It was awful. We had so many. There are so many different things to think about. You need something that's searchable, that you can trademark in different regions of the world. You need to make sure the URL is available. So actually, we ended up making up a word that didn't exist, and we decided we're going to create a brand around that word.
Okay, so
I think it does matter.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, here's a question about pitching. When sending out pitches, opinions to press, should we pitch as individuals, as the co-founders of a startup, or an organisation as an entity? So how personal does it become? Do I pitch as the person who started the business? Do I pitch as the business?
If you're pitching an opinion, it's going to be your opinion that you're pitching, so you should pitch as a person. I think that is personal. If you're pitching the product, then you pitch as the business. I think make it personal. I think, especially opinions in media, they have to be personal, so I would say pitch personally.
Okay, and does that matter as the company grows? Because clearly you want to identify a good spokesperson, and someone who's founded the company usually is in the best position for that. But we all know of businesses that have become very entwined with personality, and certainly you can see the PR value that, say, a Richard Branson can give to a Virgin project, but not all businesses are that lucky to have that balance. When does the personal become too much?
There is definitely a tipping point, at which point the personality can become the greatest asset of the company and also the greatest liability. And I think EasyJet is a great example of that, where Stelios actually became problematic for the brand over more than he gave to it. I think at the beginning, though, you're looking for space in a very crowded media or analyst market. Personality is going to be quite important, but at some point you have to make a decision. When does the founder or the CEO stop having time to invest? Who else might have good relationships, and perhaps where might there be better spokespeople involved? And at some point you do have to spread it out among the rest of the business for sure.
Great. Now, we have some analyst questions. So targeting people in terms of the investment side of a business, I can see is very important, and it's interesting. We've got a couple of questions on that front. And Kate, you talked about, for instance, working with a business who very clearly wanted the outcome in terms of a sale and wanted to reach the right investors and convince them of the right message. So I think these questions are very much relevant and interesting. First one is, and I guess this is opposed to journalists who want information. This question says, surely analysts need much different information. How would you prepare for them?
They do want different information. First of all, they want, well, if you're talking about, I'm not talking about financial analysts, first of all. I'm not a financial expert at all in that way, and there are so many regulations and rules around what you can and can't say, but I'm talking specifically about trade analysts at this stage. Analysts do need different information. They want advanced information. They don't want to know after you've done something. They want to know before you're doing it. They then want absolute proof. They want data. They want hard facts. I'm not saying that journalists don't also want those things, but they're absolutely essential to analysts. Opinions are not going to cut it, so you do have to prepare differently. You have to have absolutely watertight facts and figures. You have to have somebody who's talking to analysts who really understands the financial workings of the company, who really knows the product roadmap. You know, you don't want to put your marketing person, for example, on that call. Well, you might do. They might be exactly the right person, but you don't want somebody who just talks in marketing terms. So yes, you do have to prepare differently.
And as you said, the financial markets, there's very specialist knowledge and expertise in those. There's a question here about how you find influential analysts. Many influential analysts have a very low Twitter profile. Where else can I find them?
Yeah, some of the analysts might have low social media profiles, but some of them actually, if you know the analyst's house, if you want to go and find the right people at Gartner or Forrester, for example, you do some digging around on their site. They're very often quoted in press releases, they're very often quoted in media. You can just do your research in that way. If you can afford it, then obviously go and hire somebody who really knows their stuff and who knows these analysts. Mostly, if you're going through people like Gartner and Forrester, there's a very specific process that you go through where you go in through a central contact and you put in what it is that you're pitching to them, and then the person at the other end of the analyst house will then farm that out to the right people. So actually you don't have to get involved in that process at all. So it can be quite simple actually to do it.
And what about journalists? I mean, I'll put in a slight plug here because of course Cision has a database of journalists and influencers, as does its sister company Gorkana. But the question here is how to find prospects on social media. And I'm assuming this means journalists, and how can you find people who are interested in your story?
I think there are two things, aren't there? They might be journalists, at which point actually it's fairly straightforward to find them, because most journalists these days, if they want to be found on Twitter, will have their Twitter handle actually on their profile within the publication. So again, it's doing your research. Databases, I mean, we use databases, of course. You know, you should do that, but actually there's nothing like actually going and reading what that person said on Twitter and really, you know, knowing and understanding them. If you want to find prospects on Twitter, then sales prospects, and I would say go and, again, it's just a question of taking the time to do your research. There's no really quick way of doing it, but you can find communities of people, you can get involved in Twitter chats, for example, around the areas that your prospects might be interested in, and then you can just start to track, use a monitoring tool that will start to track conversations on social media, so you can get involved in those conversations, see who the influencers are. There's no really quick way around it, I don't think.
Kate, I've got a question about media, or mediums, which isn't technically a word, but the question here is, what do you think is currently the best medium to do PR? Social media? If so, which ones are best? Paper adverts, etc., e.g. a sleep product? So I guess the question is, do you still think that there's a role for the print press, print media? Is social media actually the best conduit at the moment for getting a startup message out there?
Depends, and I hate not having definite answers on things like this, but it really does depend what sector you're in. If you're a financial services company, then probably social media isn't necessarily the place because of all the regulation involved around it. If you're selling a consumer product, then possibly it is. But again, what you want actually is to get other people talking about your product on social media. So that still goes back to the basic principles of create great content, eye-catching videos or images on social media that can be shared. So yes, it could be very good for consumer products, probably not necessarily brilliant for B2B. It really depends on what your sector is and where your audiences are. And it comes down to understanding where your audiences are.
Excellent. And Kate, thank you. We're covering so much ground at the moment. We've got probably 5 minutes left for questions. So if you've got any burning questions to ask Kate, do send them in and we will try and get them answered. That might mean they're quick answers as well, Kate. But before we come on to, there's a few things about priorities which I want to sort of finish off with. But before we come on to that, you mentioned about PR not being in a silo in a business and talked about sort of staff engagement. So we've got a question which is, how do you engage your staff with good PR practice? Is that easy to do?
I think it's easier to do if you have a good relationship with your staff already. If you are a company that people don't want to work for, it's going to be much harder to engage them in doing good PR for the company. If you've got people that actually really love working for the company, then they're naturally going to be much more positive about you and they're going to be much more open to helping you in your PR efforts. So I think it comes down to how you behave and also the guidelines that you put out. So just make sure that people really understand why, not just giving the rules about what you can and can't do, but why they can and can't do certain things. If they understand, for example, that if they do this, the company might be in crisis, they could lose their job, then that's a very clear message. Or actually, incentivizing them to. I would never incentivize somebody to post nice things about the company, but if they have an incentive or they're motivated to be generally nice about the company, they can be your kind of front line when things go wrong too.
And what about content? So we've got a question here about press releases. Kate, what are your top tips for the perfect press release? Depends what press release is about. Short, concise, jargon-free. Think about headlines in a different way. Think about them as email subject lines that are going to get the journalist's attention rather than great big long headers. Cut out any kind of jargon from the first sentence. Try and write your story. And there was a notorious one journalist who said he would only take PR pictures on Twitter because it meant that PR people had to reduce their messages to 140 characters, which was a bit hard. So I'd say really just be as short as you can, bullet points. Don't think about it as crafting a perfect story. Think about the information the journalist wants. Get him all the information they want. Bullet points, quotes, images, everything they need. I'm going to add one piece of advice to that, actually. I think also, which is keep it active. Make sure that if you think about it, it's a company doing something. Make sure every language you use in the press release is as active as possible, so that it gives it a sense of urgency and makes people. It just tells the story better.
Yeah.
Great. Kate, I think we should finish with a couple of sort of priorities and summing up. I think so. One question here is, what should be the very first steps for a new business looking to improve upon its reputation and grow its brand?
Know what you want to be known for. The very first thing you should do, and I talked about my client who came to us with a very, very little amount of money, I mean really a couple of £1,000 to do a PR project. And the first thing that she needed to do was messaging. She needs to understand what she should be saying to the market, and that is the first place you should start. If you have to unpick messaging halfway through a PR campaign, it's really difficult. You need to get it right at the beginning.
Great. And then we got a question that's just been sent in, but it's so good. I think I need to ask this before I ask you to sum up the sort of one takeaway you want from people from this webinar. And this question is: there is a lot of competition out there, so you need to think creatively to have your voice heard. Would it help to be deliberately controversial when you were talking about a particular subject?
Sometimes, yes, it really does help, but you have to make sure that controversy is not going to damage your business. We had a client once in the telco sector who went on to the Today programme to talk about BT wasn't opening up its exchanges to new competition. And he had a particular quote that said, BT says there's no space in their exchanges for new competitors. There is room to play tennis in most of the BT exchanges. And that was a lovely, lovely quote and very controversial and got him a huge amount of coverage and actually did quite well. That was a good thing for the business. But if you're going to be deliberately controversial, that could be damaging. You don't want to suddenly say, I support, I don't know, something that might be controversial, something that Donald Trump's done, and then find out that you've got a backlash against you and consumers are then taking against you. So just be very careful about what it is. Great.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. There's some great questions there. You've helped us cover so much territory there that it's been great to see those. And thank you for those. Kate, I'm just going to ask you one final thing before I wrap up, and that is, out of all this, we've covered so much ground. You've talked about so many things. What do you think is the one key thing you want people to take away from this webinar?
Think about your story. What's your story as a business? What's the thing you want to be known for? What's the thing you want to tell people? What's the thing you want your customers to tell their customers? If you're letting go of your message, how do you want to be described by them? So think about your business in terms of a story, and think from your customer's point of view, not from your product point of view.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm afraid the worst part of my job is that I've always got to cut things short, but I want to make sure that we end on time. So I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but thank you again, everyone, for taking part in this webinar and so much for all of your questions. I want to finish by thanking Kate for her answers to all of those questions, her presentation, and her 25 tips and more to take away. And I hope that you found them all very useful, and do look out for our follow-up email. We hope at Cision that you enjoyed the webinar, and please keep your eyes peeled for the next in our Cision webinar series. Thank you to everyone who's been able to join us for the webinar, and I hope you'll join us next time. The webinar is now over.